A critical moment in the campaign, a sitting and a former president facing off, hoping to win the office.
You're the sucker. You're the loser.
He should apologize to me right now.
The stance each candidate is taking and what it means for Texas.
Our mission, number one, is to end gun violence, period.
The country's top doctor has declared gun violence a public health crisis, what the U.S. Surgeon General recommends, and the work already being done in Texas.
Our letter is asking the Biden administration to change course and to start including Texas.
Connecting the grid, the latest push from congressmen in Capitol Hill to keep the lights on in Texas during an emergency.
Produced from the Capitol in Austin and airing statewide, this is the award-winning State of Texas.
Our top story, former Uvalde School District Police Chief Pete Arredondo turned himself in this week and was booked on 10 counts of child abandonment and endangerment. A former school police officer, Adrian Gonzales, faces the same charges. According to a House Investigative Committee report, Gonzales was one of the first officers to enter Robb Elementary the day 19 children and 2 teachers were killed in a mass shooting. The indictments for Arredondo and Gonzales are the first charges since the deadly shooting at Robb Elementary 2 years ago. Hello and thank you for joining us. I'm Josh Hinkle. Here in the studio with us now is Ryan Chandler, who is following this story. Ryan, what have you uncovered here?
Well, here's the indictments, and what we know is that the grand jury, after months of hearing evidence, has indicted both Arredondo and Gonzales with 10 counts of abandoning and endangering children. Essentially, what they are arguing is that Arredondo's failure to identify the situation as an active shooting, his failure to respond as he was trained to do, and the delays in their response were not just incompetence, they were incriminating. This goes beyond just a failure to do your job and has actually escalated to a criminal offense.
How do the families of the victims feel about the arrests?
It's not enough. It's not enough for them. There were almost 400 police officers who responded to Robb Elementary that day. This is a step toward accountability for 2 of them. But when you ask them, they say that this is not about putting people in jail. What they are calling for is systematic structural reform to make sure that the tragedy that they are continuing to endure does not happen to any other families. They're calling for legislative change in terms of gun policy, raising the age to buy an assault weapon to 21. Putting in place safe gun storage rules and universal background checks. They're calling for all of the officers who responded that day to resign or face more accountability. This is certainly welcome news for them, but it is not the end of their calls for justice.
Yeah, where do we go from here?
Well, I mentioned 376 police officers responded that day. 92 of them were with the Texas Department of Public Safety. The families are leading a lawsuit against every single DPS trooper who was on the scene, suing them in their personal capacity for these same allegations of incompetence and a dereliction of duty that day, calling for civil damages from each one of them. There's also continued calls again for political change next legislative session to try and keep the memories of their children alive through change, not just through criminal proceedings, but through real societal change. These families, despite being happy with what is happening here, are not going away anytime soon in their calls for accountability.
All right, Ryan, we know you'll be watching this closely. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
After almost 5 months of oral arguments, the Texas Supreme Court upheld a law banning certain treatment options for transgender minors in the state. The majority opinion stated Senate Bill 14 does not violate the Texas Constitution and that state lawmakers have the right to regulate the medical field. A group of families, doctors, and LGBTQ+ advocates sued the state to block the law from taking effect and expressed their disappointment at the court's decision. The law remains in effect and bars young people from receiving puberty-blocking medication, hormone therapies, or surgeries to assist in their transition. Attorney General Ken Paxton said his office will work to make sure doctors are following the law. Last year's regular legislative session saw a record number of proposals introduced that would affect the state's LGBTQ+ population. Investigator Arzo Dos took a deep dive into Senate Bill 14. Look for it on our website this week in our State of Texas story. A rematch 4 years in the making. President Biden and former President Trump faced off in the first debate of this election cycle in Atlanta, Georgia.
We are living right now in a rat's nest, and because of his ridiculous, insane, and very stupid policies, people are coming in.
And if I'm elected, I'm going to restore Roe v. Wade. He was the worst in all of American history.
If he wins this election, our country doesn't have a chance.
The fallout only the beginning from a debate that could help shape this race.
And we're back with more campaign context, fresh off the first debate of the 2024 presidential cycle. President Biden and former President Trump going head-to-head in Atlanta. Before the debate, a new Biden campaign ad really went there and called Trump a convicted criminal after Trump's recent felony hush money conviction in New York. And Biden brought that up again during the debate. But as for whether this even resonates with voters, we look to this month's fresh polling numbers from the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas, which showed 50% of Republicans say Trump's conviction makes them much more likely to support him in the 2024 presidential election. Now, for some context on that, we went straight to one of the researchers behind the poll, James Henson.
I think a lot of this is what we would call confirmation, or a kind of a means of social expression rather than an indication that anybody's minds have changed. Most people out there, particularly Republicans and Democrats, know what they think about Donald Trump.
The poll also found Trump's favorability ratings went up a few points among Republicans compared to this time last year, and his disapproval ratings went up among Democrats and independents. But Henson points out all of that movement is still within the margin of error, so not a lot of people changing their minds at this point in the race. Look for more campaign context headed your way as election season rolls on.
Joining us is Niall Stanage, White House columnist for The Hill. Thank you for being here.
Good to be here.
So after the debate, some Democrats called for Biden to step aside. How serious are those conversations, and could that actually be done?
They are very serious conversations because by any measure, this was a pretty disastrous debate for President Biden. It really put a sharp point on all the existing concerns about his age and his mental acuity. Now, he has the Democratic nomination if he wants it, because of course he won overwhelming victories in the primaries. The question is whether he could be persuaded to step aside. And that seems doubtful. It's possible, but doubtful. It would have to be a voluntary decision on his part.
Now, the latest polls from the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas show 50% of Republicans say Trump's conviction makes them much more likely to support him. During the debate, President Biden kept bringing up his conviction. Is this the strategy from his campaign to get votes, and is it working?
Well, what we know from the polls is that President Biden appears to lag nationally by about a percentage point and is behind in most of the swing states. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that is a bad argument that you have just outlined, because of course it doesn't just depend on Republicans. It could be that that argument has some traction with independent voters, with people in the middle ground. I would say, though, the lack of vigor in President Biden's debate performance rendered many of his arguments pretty ineffective.
Polling shows that Texans don't believe Biden is doing enough to deal with the immigration issue. Was there anything in the debate that could change their mind, in your opinion?
I don't think so, and I don't say that to beat up on the president. Immigration, we know, is basically his weakest issue, not just in Texas, but across the nation. And he didn't really make a particularly strong case for changing people's mind in that regard in the debate. Now, the kind of rhetoric we heard from former President Trump was the kind of rhetoric he often uses about the border and about migrants. Some people like that. It turns others off. But your question's really about, was there a game changer on the immigration issue? And I certainly didn't see one.
All right, Niall Stanage, White House columnist for The Hill. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Gun violence has now become the leading cause of death among kids and teens. And that was not true a decade ago or 2 decades ago.
The recommendations from the U.S. Surgeon General to end gun violence, a deep dive into one of those ideas and what a public health crisis means in Washington, D.C.
We've had an electric grid with a Texas-shaped donut hole in it for the longest period of time.
a push to keep the lights on in Texas. One congressman is calling on the Biden administration to take action. Hear his plan this summer to prevent blackouts.